construction of a massive building with other facilities, barbed wire surrounding it. Here's a massive expansion of a re-education center in Shula County near Kashgar. So this is the original. Take a look. I'm showing you the scale of the expansion of this facility. To hold leaders. Who are the people being rounded up? Whose information is being collected? You know, look at this. This student right here. This is the soccer star who is part of the Kansas National Junior team. Here's a pop star, not a religious extremist. As you can see, he's not somebody who might say, I want to go do jihad. He's obviously someone in the midst of popular culture who's been missing for over 2 years. This is an anthropologist. She's spoken at University of Pennsylvania, a number of universities. She's been missing since December 2017. Her daughter lives here in the United States. And you can imagine the agony that she's going through, unable to contact her mother. No news, no sentence, nothing. This is Nicholas Hosuh, who is the only survivor of the camp, who's managed to make it both out of the camps and out of China. She's actually living in Washington, D.C. I know her well. This is a very tragic story. She went home. She was living abroad, went home. She had triplets. Needed to go home and have her mother and father help take care of them. She arrived at the airport, black could taken over, had children taken away. She didn't see them for 2 months. And she was finally allowed to interrogated, beaten, and so on. Locked up with 6 other women in a single cell that had a bucket in the corner of the toilet. She was allowed to get out. She was, by a miracle, at least after 2 months, immediately went to the hospital when a child had died. So the 3-month-old child was going to her death, even if she was still alive, and there's a wife and children. This is a famous singer. I can tell you more about that. These are reporters who work for Radio Creation, which is the only legal language media in the world. They're based in Washington, by the U.S. Congress. Amazing work, and all of them have relatives between 6 of them, with 30 relatives. Here's a family in Australia. Australian families left devastated by China's massive detention of leaders. The extension of intimidation and, in fact, terrorization of leaders wherever they are extended, I say, to Australia. And here there were messages sent to students in France demanding their personal information. Take a picture outside your workplace, sending your French ID, your Chinese ID, really horrifying stuff. Here are some of the headlines. The Washington Post has really been on this issue. Wall Street Journal as well, The Guardian, Globe and Mail, Foreign Policy, looking for action in the face of quite extensive and really shocking human rights violations that the world should not remain silent about. And this is my friend Yushan. She was a post op-ed. Her sister is missing. She's a doctor. She wanted to protect her. She was back to the China state, but she's gone. So I'm trying to tell you the indiscriminate nature and targeting of people basically only for their ethno-religious background and not because they are in some way militants or planning violent action. As I said, the Washington Post is on this. 10 editorials in the last 10 months. Very admirable. And so let's talk a little bit about what's going on. Why is this horrific thing happening? Of course, the Belt and Road requires stability in Xinjiang. The stability in Xinjiang allows local officials and local security agencies to have larger budgets, to let contracts to build all those camps I showed you, to have kickbacks. So their financial, or let's say, self-interest, economic interest, bureaucratic and power interest, and then reasons of state why there was a sudden decision to have kind of total control state in Xinjiang. And just to give you a sense of what it's not just construction, it's also the high-tech surveillance state. I just think this should shock you. So this researcher who's a tech guy, all right? This is not a political person, not a human rights person. Happens to find this database by SenseNet, this company that is one of the ones developing a lot of AI in China. This database he found exposed just in 24 hours a stream of nearly 6.7 million GPS coordinates being recorded, actively tracking users as they moved around. Here's some pictures. So what's happening? I would say that other governments are acting. The UN is acting, but I'm just going to concentrate on the U.S. right now. There is an act coming in Congress with Very bipartisan support. Marco Rubio, Republican, Ron Menendez, Democrat, same thing in the House. And here we have very high level support for Nancy Pelosi herself, Speaker of the House. There's action for global Magnitsky sanctions. These sanctions are designed to enable the U.S. government to have an instrument to make sure there are penalties for those engaged in massive human rights violations or massive theft of democracy. So I will give you, just bringing it home to the university setting. My organization, the League of Human Rights Project, has issued 3 reports in the last 6 months. Here's one specifically about intellectuals who are recognized for montage. Here's the numbers we released in June. We identified, despite these conditions of complete secrecy, families don't know where their family members are. But nonetheless, we were able to identify 338, including 61 university instructors. Here's the data from the March report. It's gone up to 386 people. Something's still missing, including 77 university instructors. Now, I'll say very early on, scholars of Xinjiang, that's purely academic people, not activists, not politicians, were highly alarmed at the unusual step of writing a long statement. You probably read it, Michael. I don't know if you signed it. It's 12 pages long, detailing what was known. Had 646 signatures at the end of January. It hasn't been updated, but I know there are many more. So our biggest policy question is for the university communities. We have 77 professors in detention. What does that say about the Ministry of Education in China? Is that the kind of ministry that our own universities in other places should be cooperating with? If you look at other countries that have conducted campaigns of massive ethnic repression, locking people up indefinitely, as you may know, the number is about 1.5 million as a minimum people altogether, but among them, we know these professors are gone, and I just think everyone needs to, our position is that people need to think about it and look at the judgment of history before they continue business as usual. Speaking of business, companies are also involved. I will give you a picture, again, of the tech companies. Here are just the easily found surveillance cameras just on this little back street. So the companies that are particularly involved, $1 billion contract government of Xinjiang include Vision and Dahua, which most people haven't heard of, except, of course, they may well be on the Tufts campus. So I think activists and students who are concerned and said, let's see, this company is actively participating in installing cameras everywhere, and should those cameras be the same ones that we use on campuses? So it's $1 billion in contracts, facial recognition cameras in mosques, the re-education camps, and the surveillance. Eric Prince 2. So this, I would like to invite you to go to my organization's website if you're interested in learning more. What is the evidence? What is the policy implications? And in particular, I want to note that we do have a Chinese language website for anyone who's more comfortable reading Chinese. I would certainly invite you to follow us on social media for the latest updates, see what the evidence is again. And here are some of the relatives who are in Kazakhstan. These relatives are missing. We do not know where they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Next up, we have Michael Davis. Michael Davis is a professor of law and international affairs at Jindal Global University and a senior fellow at the Lead Institute for Asian Studies at Notre Dame. He was once a democracy fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and has published commentary on newspapers such as New York Times and South China Morning. Today, he will be giving a presentation on Hong Kong.
Okay, so here we go from a police state to region that has been ranked among the freest in the world. Hong Kong is often at the very top of the list in the Freedom Index. Often also very highly regarded regarding the rule of law. So it's interesting to me because I also work on the Tibet issue a lot. And a year or so ago, I was in Dharamsala, India, where we had what was called a 550 conference. 5 years and 50 years, what should Tibetans do? That's how government. And I was asked to speak at this, and I told them, can I speak about Hong Kong? Because for Tibetans and ethnic regions in China, they're promised autonomy, they're not given it. They had a dream, something like the Hong Kong model would be it, sort of get in sort of independence, it would be to get a high degree of autonomy, and that was secure. And so I said, the reason I thought the Tibetans should hear about the Hong Kong model, and more or less the talk I'm getting here today, the slides, is because if they are looking to have an agreement with China, which they sometimes talk about, this story may be what they wind up with Chinese interference at almost every juncture in how this autonomy is delivered. Because this conference is said to be a focus on U.S. policy, I thought I should start just by adding this slide here, which tells us that Hong Kong is right now covered by something called the Hong Kong Policy Act. And it talks about U.S. investments and it deals with that in this year's report. They highlight a few things. They say that Hong Kong maintains a sufficient, although diminished degree of autonomy, that there are 85,000 U.S. citizens living in Hong Kong. It is judged to be the freest society. It works with the U.S. on law enforcement and commerce and so on. At the same time, just this past month or two ago, the U.S.-China Economic Security Commission issued a report where they said that it starts to question whether Hong Kong should have separate customs status in the area of technology because of Beijing interference in Hong Kong. So right now, Hong Kong is treated almost like a separate country for U.S. trade relationship. But because Beijing is so much intruding into Hong Kong, this commission of the U.S. Congress said maybe we have to investigate that maybe that distinct status for Hong Kong. And this caused, of course, a great deal of anxiety in Hong Kong because its economy depends on this. And Hong Kong's economy is very important to China. While its percentage of the Chinese economy has gone down, still it is basically the New York of China. It's the financial capital of China. It's where all kinds of business deals and stuff can take place within a rule of law environment. So that's important. U.S. Congress is also, we got Marco Rubio again. Marco Rubio seems to be everywhere. But he's also proposed an act called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. So that's something on the radar. What I want to do, and it's kind of hard to do, and I thought about not using slides at all, but I think that as Luisa showed us, pictures or say 1,000 words, so sometimes it's useful. I want to give a very brief account of the political context, and then the legal narrative, which is the harder part. Hong Kong, one of the students here asked me the other day, how do you use law in the area of China and human rights and policy? Well, you use it a lot in Hong Kong, because almost every protest on the streets in Hong Kong is over the Hong Kong Basic Law. So it's like the U.S. I mean, this country's history is one of civil rights movements under the U.S. Bill of Rights, very legal oriented. I spent a lot of time in India. India is another country like that that has a lot of attention to law. So the legal narrative is very important. It's very much about what the street protests are involved. And then I want to talk about the street if I have time. I suggest not reading so carefully what I'm saying. I just put this here so it's there. We can kind of jump through some of these because they're not, they need not dwell on. What I have here is a slide highlighting China's policies that find themselves into the Hong Kong newspapers all the time, causing a lot of concern in Hong Kong. One is the passage of a restricted foreign NGO law. A few years ago, even one of my students was a member of this group called Yuan Ping, where feminists were arrested because they were protesting men groping them on transit in China. So they don't arrest the men, they arrest the women who protested. Crackdowns on ethnic minority groups, of course, Xinjiang, as we just heard, is the big case. 200 lawyers arrested. Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel laureate, died in custody. A lot of pressure on universities in China, a lot of pressure on the internet. This is all in the Hong Kong press because Hong Kong has to deal with and have anxiety about these issues. China's policies also reach directly into Hong Kong. One is a white paper, which I'm going to mention in a minute, where they say people like me, legal academics, I spent my whole career at the University of Hong Kong. Legal academics are said to have a confused and lopsided view. I still teach there once a year. And my law faculty at Hong Kong U is the thing China attacks the most. Because for some reason we've earned their anxiety and respect, I guess, respect as an adversary, because of course we know just this past week, one of my colleagues was convicted for leading the umbrella movement a couple of years ago. There was actually 9 convictions. I used to teach at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. One of my colleagues there was convicted as well. So that department I taught in at the Chinese University and the law faculty at Hong Kong U seem to stand out in the university environment. There's growing pressure in Hong Kong to enact laws under Article 23. Article 23 is an article in the basic law which says that Hong Kong has to enact on its own laws on national security, sedition, subversion, secrecy, and so on. So that Article 23, we'll revisit it in a moment. Lots of pressure on universities in Hong Kong, I just mentioned that, on the media, on booksellers, and recently China even got mad because Hong Kong people always, in sports games, boo the Chinese team. So then Hong Kong passed a law called the National Anthem Law, where people will get arrested if they disrespect China during the national anthem. It's hard to believe that in Hong Kong you can't boo Chinese national team, which Hong Kong people are fond of doing. Hong Kong civil society protests, I just list some of them here. The first one is the one that gets me, because I was a member of the Article 23 concern group. And a decade, now more than a decade ago, 2003, a bunch of us sat down, 9 of us, sat down in a room, no windows, I remember, and a long table, and wrote a bunch of pamphlets, distributed them on the street, opposing the government's proposal to enact these national security laws. We thought we're not going to get anywhere with this, that maybe at worst we'll make the law unpopular and they'll pass it anyhow. But we were surprised. The public took an interest. We wound up with 500,000 protesters in support of our pamphlets and our cause, and eventually the government withdrew it. So this was my sort of introduction to fire in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, if students here who think they might want to be an academic someday, Hong Kong is a place where academics are often very active. National education, China wanted to impose patriotic education in Hong Kong. And there were protests led by people whose faces we'll see, and the proposals were withdrawn. Many of you have heard of the umbrella movement. So all these things took place. In fact, the young men, you can see during the umbrella protest what the streets looked like. I recall these streets very well. And these two on the right are the ones who were involved in the national education protest when they were still like 14, 15 years old. And then came back to the streets in the umbrella movement. And they were both sentenced to jail, spent some time in jail after 2014. The one on the left is Benny Todd, my colleague at Hong Kong U, who's recently been convicted of conspiracy to create a public nuisance and incitement to public nuisance. So these are some of the people. I showed this slide only to show you how peaceful protest can be in Hong Kong. You know, look who's belligerent here. It's not the protester. So this is an example. After pro-democracy people were kicked out of the legislative council, there was a protest, and this is a protester. Here, I get to the legal narrative. I'm going to jump through this real fast because I don't have much time, but it just because it is so important. So don't try to read it. Let me just pick what's important. Here, just to note, the joint declaration was signed in 1984. That's why Hong Kong has a distinctive status. People in Hong Kong were told to put their hearts at ease, not to worry. The hand over to China, China will leave Hong Kong alone. Okay. And even in Article 7 there, both governments commit to fully carry out this 50 years of special administrative region of China. Hong Kong Basic Law is enacted and stipulated in the Joint Declaration. So most of its content is literally taken from that treaty. And then The Basic Law promises democracy. It says the ultimate aim in Hong Kong is that the chief executive of Hong Kong is like the president, would be elected by universal suffrage upon nomination. This is critical language. Upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee. So unlike what's going on with the Democrats here in the US, parties can't nominate the candidate. This nominating committee has to do that. And this was what the umbrella movement was about. It was a fight over this nomination process, with the local people wanting the nomination committee to be broadly representative so that Democrats could be candidates. And what ultimately happened is Beijing said, no, we're going to use the nominating committee like the Guardian Council in Iran and decide who can run for office. And no pan-Democrats, they're not invited to run. So like Trump on the border, you're not invited, or pan-Democrats weren't invited as well. So this is a critical language in the Basic Law. And then we have decisions. Ultimately, what they said is, right now the chief executive of Hong Kong is chosen by an election committee of pro-Beijing figures, okay? And eventually Beijing said the dominating committee has to be like that election committee. And this is why the protesters took to the streets of the umbrella movement. Hong Kong people see one thing as imperative. Hong Kong has a rule of law, and that the autonomy of Hong Kong is primarily about guarding the rule of law. And they take the view from long experience that the Hong Kong government, essentially chosen by Beijing, chief executive, will not guard Hong Kong's autonomy. So we need democracy. So these democracy protests are not just about democracy. They're about having a government that represents the people and will guard Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong people are moderate. They're not going to be wanting to go to war against China, but they want a government that has a voice, that will speak out and represent their concerns. I think they have a very moderate expectation of this government, and they don't think the local government now in place can do this. Just noting here that Hong Kong is one of the places in the world where the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is part of the Basic Law. It's incorporated in Article 39. So the ICCPR applies like a Bill of Rights in Hong Kong. Okay? So that's an important legal point. This white paper I mentioned earlier, the white paper was issued right before the protest. And the white paper essentially seemed to say that the Sino-British Treaty no longer mattered. Even in spite of that Article 7 I pointed out to you, it says it's binding forever, because the white paper says that the authority for Hong Kong system comes entirely from the authorization of the central leadership, not from a treaty, okay? And they take the 12 articles of the Sino-British Treaty and reproduce them in this white paper and say, this is coming from us only. And then at the same time in London, Beijing said that the Sino-British Treaty was no longer valid, that Hong Kong had been handed over, it was done. They later backed off on that claim, but still you can see that China takes a very dim view of its international obligation. On the rule of law, they basically said that the National People's Congress Standing Committee will guard Hong Kong's rule of law. And of course, very few people in Hong Kong are confident about that. On the courts, they said judges are administrative officials. They're in effect not judges. They are supposed to administer the law and guard the nation's security. So they're putting pressure on the courts through this white paper. They say very little about democracy, so I won't go into that because I want to get first to this question: can you have freedom without democracy? It's a good question. Can you have freedom without democracy? I've written millions op-eds in newspapers saying no, but there are people who seem to think we could do that, so we'll see. And now I get to what I think is more interesting to see pictures, and that's the street, to understand what's going on the street there. Some students I've met here at Fletcher at Tufts have gone to Hong Kong, and they sometimes, I teach these classes where international students come in, and they're amazed to go to the streets of Hong Kong when these protests unfold. Sometimes, as you see in this picture, they can be quite amazing. And generally they're extremely nonviolent. Like that guy laying in front of all the policemen. Hong Kong people have read all the literature on nonviolence. Okay, so Benny Tai, in fact, made it his full-time job lecturing on nonviolent strategies, that everybody should lie down and not do anything and just be carried away and so on. So this kind of culture, but sometimes things get rough because the police are trying to push people back. After this protest, we have a kind of situation for the first time in all the years I've been in Hong Kong, that people started demanding independence. And they started having a kind of localist movement, where they said, we are not Chinese, we're Hong Kongers. I even have t-shirts my daughter gave me that says in Chinese in the back and English in the front, Hong Konger. I lived there for 30 years, so I feel like a Hong Konger as well. Okay. So this is the kind of localism that's going on there. In some cases, it's become radicalized into calls for independence. And you see here these protests again, and people, you know, one of the things is, what causes people to take to the streets? And what we find in Hong Kong and many places in the world is state-led. States cause protests. And so in Hong Kong, it's the way the state behaves. And again, I've written endless op-eds trying to convince China and Hong Kong governments that if you take these repressive tactics, you're going to get pushback. It's kind of Newton's law. With force in one way, you're going to get force in the other. That's how protests occur. That lightening up a little bit might cause a lot of this to go away. Oh, you're just holding that for the microphone. So here we have an allegation that the father of the independence movement in Hong Kong is the former chief executive of Hong Kong, because he was so hardline in the way he treated the protesters. So the state-centered argument, the Article 23 movement, when I said we sat in that room and we didn't know we would have 500,000 people following us down the street, it was because that was before the state misbehaved. We had officials doing this, I won't say which finger they were holding up their car window. We had all kinds of attacks on us, and we were brought before officials and lectured on our misinformed states of mind and so on. After all of that, people came to the street. And when journalists held microphones in their face and said, why are you out here protesting? Because I want to protect our free speech. How do you know your free speech is threatened? Because those lawyers said so. So literally, the question I got last night about the law, it can be real. As a young lawyer, if some of you are that one day, you can have a lawyer, and it can matter. Here we got the umbrella movement. These are street scenes. The use of tear gas. I was there on the night when they used tear gas. What happened is the police, when the protests began, what caused the people to start coming out? The young people in the picture I showed you, jumped over a fence so that they could stand in the civic square. There's actually a civic square that was created for people to protest that was blocked off. So they climbed over the fence. They were eventually prosecuted for that, sent to jail. But on that night, the internet was alive and well, and thousands of people were coming to that area. And what happened is there's a footbridge over the highway. The police blocked it. So I was standing there and I was thinking, gee, what's going to happen? Well, it didn't take long. So many people piled up behind the obstruction that eventually they pushed it over into the highway, to cross the main highway into the city to go to the protest area. And then they got tear gassed. And then they stayed in the highway for 79 days. So the moral of the story is that they had not blocked it off, the protests would have all been in a park area by the government offices, and maybe you never would have heard of the umbrella movement. The umbrellas were being used to block the tea bags. So this is what I mean by a state-led movement. Okay, we're getting close here. Some violence, not very often, but there was a so-called fish mall protest. There are radicals in Hong Kong, but almost, it's just stunning throughout all of this, almost no violence at all, except by people attacking the protesters. Fracture within political camps in Hong Kong. One of the problems with a place where only a minority can get elected to the legislature and the majority is controlled by an authoritarian government is that the Democrats can't take power. And this tends to fracture them. They're always an opposition camp instead of imagining that they take the government and have to behave in ways that might even the pro-government camp, I know here, gets sometimes fractured. And here we get these calls for independence, and you see in Chinese, if you can read it, that the Julie Lindau is there, the chief executive of Hong Kong, the independence father. You can see some of the faces of politicians. Almost all of these have been kicked out of the legislative council because the government didn't like the oath they took when they took their seat. You see here, I'm just highlighting there's pressure on the courts because now all these people are taken to the courts. And the judges are expected to be the nasties and do the bidding of the government. And that's what happened in this recently. I've been on the media, RTHK Public Radio, a lot. I will be again tomorrow in Hong Kong talking about this, trying to understand that what's really the problem with the conviction. These guys engaged in a civil disobedience campaign. If they had simply been charged with unlawful assembly, they would have all pleaded guilty, and that would have been the end of it. The government cooked up not even a statutory charge. They went to the old common law to find a charge that they could charge them with public nuisance and conspiracy to public nuisance so that they can up the amount of sentence. And the sentencing will be on the 24th of April. Okay? So there's 9 of them, the so-called Hong Kong 9. And of course, this raises question, do we have political prisoners in Hong Kong? And these guys speaking right here, all 3 of them spent time in prison. They're out right now. One of them is coming over here to Yale, I think, to do a master's degree next if he can get out of Hong Kong. And then here's Joshua Wong, the young face of democracy in Hong Kong. Recently, he was given a democracy award in Washington, D.C., but he couldn't come because he's under sentence and appeal. Right? And then I could add a new slide in about 10 days' time when it will be my colleagues of Hong Kong U and Chinese U who will probably be part of our new people. So again, this is perhaps not as horrific as the story in Xinjiang, but it's very concerning because it represents, not the most extreme horrific things, but a situation in a city that's not unlike the city we're in right now, of people that are relatively free of everything, and this sort of, as one scholar once wrote the title to his article, a kind of darkness at the edge of town. And it's corruption creeping across the border, it's pressure on all the institutions, and so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Now we're gonna Skype Olivia back in.
Great. Can you see me? Can you hear me okay?
Hello?
Yeah, I can.
So she's doing
Is it better? Turn off my camera?
No, we can put the camera on.
Okay, great.
Hi. I'm gonna give you a short introduction. Olivia is a policy analyst in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation who specializes in human rights and traditional criminal issues, including human trafficking and human smuggling, drug trafficking, religious freedom, refugee issues, and other social and humanitarian challenges towards Asia, particularly in China. Olivia, the floor is all yours. You have about 2 minutes.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I want to apologize that I'm not there in person. I really wanted to be there, but unfortunately I was so sick yesterday. So thank you for working with me and finding an alternative. I really enjoyed hearing both Louisa and Michael's presentations, and I want to start off my presentation by thinking about how China human rights issues fit into current U.S. strategy. And in particular, I want to highlight the role of human rights in the Trump administration's so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. The Indo-Pacific strategy itself includes really vague references to human rights. And if you drill down on it a little bit more specifically, the administration defines free as promoting the sovereignty of the US and individual countries in Asia, freedom from coercion, and promoting human rights. The latter of which I would say is probably the least developed aspect of US strategy. But it also defines open, meaning open communication, open sea lines of communication, airways, open trade, which honestly, frankly, doesn't look quite like free trade, although they say that's a priority, and then open investment, among other things. So in short, we sort of know some of the issues that the US is committed to promoting, but frankly, little about how the US government plans to promote them, particularly in the context of China. And I think that this is fairly frustrating, possibly even concerning, given that there are so many severe human rights violations that are taking place in China. Obviously, we heard from Louisa about the severe human rights violations going on in Xinjiang, and also from Michael on Hong Kong. But there are other serious challenges that I'd like to highlight that include some of their remarks, especially focused on religious freedom. But before we go into those aspects, I want to talk about why I think it's so important that the US particularly promote human rights in China. And the first reason I would say this is because promotion of human rights has typically distinguished the US from its engagement with Asia as a whole. And I would put this sort of in contrast to China in the way that it has engaged with its neighbors in Asia. Louisa mentioned earlier in her speech the Belt and Road Initiative, or also known as One Belt, One Road. And I would say that Belt and Road is essentially a means for China to export a valueless form of foreign policy. For example, the investments that China makes are not conditioned. They don't require that countries respect basic fundamental rights of other countries. And they aren't based on mutually beneficial ends, but rather are based on China advancing its own goals and ends, which usually doesn't include promoting freedom in the various regions that it's investing in, especially human rights issues. The US, however, has typically had a rather proactive engagement strategy in Asia, one that has involved human rights. And I would actually describe China's Belt and Road Initiative in part as a response to US engagement in the region. For example, the US has alliance relationships with Japan, Korea, Thailand, Australia, the Philippines, to name a few. And in many countries, Japan and Korea in particular, investing in security there has also resulted in improvements in human rights, or at least those countries being able to focus on their additional resources on promoting human rights there. And so I think that if the US really seeks to continue to emanate strength in Asia, it should continue to promote human rights, but also emphasize that its form of engagement in Asia, in contrast to China, means that they are seeking to improve and promote the rights and values of others inside of the region. And I think that needs to be highlighted very, very strongly as we continue to think about that engagement. But I want to use that free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as sort of a backdrop for talking about a number of serious human rights violations currently taking place in China. And I want to focus in particular on the rise of religious persecution under Xi Jinping's leadership. Sinicization is a newer phenomenon that is very reminiscent of historical ways that China has interacted with religion. Sinicization is essentially the secularizing of religion so that it sort of serves and advances the Chinese Communist Party's ends. And we've seen sinicization really take root not only in the case of Xinjiang, but also in February 2018, when China instituted a new set of regulations on religious affairs. These are incredibly onerous regulations that have had implications for people of all faiths. And I want to go through a few of those in particular. So just to give you some examples of what the regulations on religious affairs include, there are some regulations that, for example, don't permit children under the age of 18 to receive any forms of religious education. or even to gather, and a form of religious education is considered the gathering of 5 or more people, which means that if a parent is teaching their children and there happen to be cousins present or grandparents present, that could be considered a religious gathering. It's extremely, extremely onerous burden on people's freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and obviously freedom of religion. I want to turn first in highlighting the various faiths who are experiencing persecution to Christianity. Between September and December of 2018, 3 large churches in China were shut down. Some of their pastors were taken into prison and interrogated, in some cases tortured. And you're seeing this all over, where crosses are being torn down. Different churches are being completely destroyed. People are being forbidden from coming together and enjoying corporate worship. We've also seen unique persecution of Catholics in China. Just last year, the Vatican negotiated a deal with China that may have serious ramifications for the future of religious freedom of Catholics inside of China. Essentially, it enables the Chinese government to appoint bishops and the Vatican to have veto power over this. And many are concerned that the Vatican's deal last year may eventually lead the Vatican to switch its official recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, which would be concerning potentially for the religious freedom of Catholics inside of Taiwan. Third, I wanted to highlight the persecution of Buddhists, especially Tibetan Buddhists. This has been ongoing severe persecution, but it heightened in recent years, particularly when Chen Guangguo was appointed as the head of the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And Chen Guangguo actually is now the head of the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, and we can talk a little bit about how his coercive form of overseeing these various autonomous regions has had implications for both. But many Tibetans do not enjoy freedom of movement, certainly do not enjoy freedom of religion, and are often persecuted, facing severe ability to freely practice their faith. And this is ongoing in large part because of the types of surveillance methods. It's called grid-style surveillance system that Chen Guangguo put in place, which means that essentially on every street corner in Tibet, there are police and individuals who are watching the various behaviors of individuals inside Tibet, with the potential for them to be taken in if they do something that is seen as offensive to the Chinese government. It's very, very serious. And fourth and finally, I want to turn to the persecution of Muslims. We heard from Louisa unbelievably harrowing stories of individuals being taken into custody. It is now believed that between 800,000 to 2 million individuals are in those political re-education facilities today. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the Congressional Executive Commission on China's report, which goes into great detail on what's taking place in Xinjiang, but also other abuses of the Chinese government. The rights violations taking place there are severe, and they are incredibly reminiscent of, I would say, the Cultural Revolution. There are a couple of features that make it particularly similar to the Cultural Revolution. One that I would say is that what's going on there is not only the rounding up of individuals, but there have been reports that individuals inside of these political education facilities are engaging in forced labor. This is very similar to the Cultural Revolution, and U.S. government is even currently in the midst of investigating whether or not goods produced by forced labor in Xinjiang made their way into the supply chains of businesses here in the U.S., and that is extraordinarily serious. Forced labor is always serious, and of course, as in the U.S., we don't want to be paying into a system that is using and abusing forced labor. And of course, the re-education facilities themselves involve not only propagandizing the populations inside of Xinjiang, but forcing them to take Mandarin lessons, which are very reminiscent of practices that were used during the Cultural Revolution. A second unique feature of what's taking place in Xinjiang is that they're taking the use of new applications of new technologies in order to engage in the surveillance state that we're seeing today. Many of you may be familiar with China's social credit system. The type of surveillance that's being used in Xinjiang may be serving as a pilot project for what's already being rolled out in terms of the surveillance efforts to monitor the entire Chinese population. But as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of the surveillance technologies being used in Xinjiang have the potential to be exported by China through the Belt and Road Initiative and otherwise. And there are already reports of this surveillance technology making its way to Africa, making its way to other countries throughout the world. And as one of my colleagues at Heritage Lake say, China's primary export through the Belt and Road Initiative is not infrastructure or monetary policy or any sort of other policies. It's really its form of authoritarianism. So we should be especially conscientious of what is taking place in Xinjiang. With that, I want to turn over to a couple of recommendations that I have for U.S. policy going forward as we think about what we should do next to respond to these serious human rights violations that not only I've discussed, but also the other panelists reviewed. The first one is I would strongly emphasize in Asia, the U.S.'s track record is a reliable, dependable partner through its hub and spokes alliance of model of engagement in Asia, which has historically enabled the U.S. to promote human rights and will be a very strong aspect of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy that may even help other countries to come on board to help encourage better human rights practices within China itself. The second would be to make more liberal use of the global Magnitsky sanctioning authorities that Treasury has. Global Magnitsky allows Treasury to target individuals on the basis on corruption and human rights grounds. And in particular, there have been calls to sanction Chen Guangguo, who is directly responsible for what takes place not only in the repression of individuals in Tibet, but what's going on today inside of Xinjiang. I would also like to highlight a couple of additional recommendations, which is that each year the U.S. government holds the International Religious Freedom Ministerial, and the current ambassador at large, Sam Brownback, has been an outspoken advocate on the Xinjiang issue. But I think that it's really important that these issues be raised at the upcoming ministerial. Last year, China received a strong condemnation from the U.S. government for its religious freedom violations at the Earth Ministerial. That has to be continued, and hopefully diplomatic efforts are undertaken to get other countries to get on board. I would strongly encourage the U.S. government to focus in the ways that it can in order to hold China accountable. And so with that, I think I'll just close there, and hopefully we can go ahead and jump into question and answer period.
Now we're gonna look the floor open to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, Olivia. I'm not sure if you can hear me, YJ. I have a question. I think you've written a lot about. You've written a lot about, how to put human rights back on the agenda, particularly as it relates to the North Korean issue. If you can just talk a little bit about that.
Yes, definitely. So I think that there is actually overlap between, some of the serious violations of human rights committed by China and those instituted in North Korea. Of course, China is North Korea's only ally, and China itself is responsible for serious human rights violations in North Korea because they ubiquitously engage in repatriating North Korean refugees who escape from North Korea into China. They send them back, many of them to death. And it's a serious human rights violation. They actually are a violation of the Refugee Convention, which, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they're a signatory to. And so there's a reason to hold China accountable even for the human rights violations going on there. But as you mentioned, YJ, I have worked a lot on North Korea in particular, and I've emphasized the need to include human rights dialogue with North Korea, both at the Singapore summit and also at the Hanoi summit. I think that a lot of times people view human rights issues as separate from national security issues, but I think almost nowhere in the world is it more clear that the human rights issues and the national security issues are intertwined than in North Korea. For example, the political prison camps is free labor for the regime. The regime often uses individuals inside the political prison camps to test their chemical and biological weapons. So in that case, the human rights abuses and the authoritarian methods of the regime are used to further develop their nuclear and missile technology. And I think that there's similar arguments that can be made in the case of China. As I mentioned in Xinjiang, the potential exporting of surveillance technology from Xinjiang has similar national security implications that should mean that the US government not only raises concerns about these issues, but that they would actually take action. It's been very frustrating. So many US government officials, including Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, and Brownback have all issued strong condemnations of what's going on in Xinjiang and other serious human rights violations in China. And yet here we are still waiting for them to even sanction the third global Magnitsky. I think it's really, the onus is on us to put pressure on the US government to take action, but it's really about time that they act in this regard.
Thank you, Olivia.
Hello, I have a question towards Professor Davis, and you spoke about kind of the role of the internet a little bit, the Hong Kong protests. I was wondering how, fitting this whole trend of securitization that's talking about the media situation and so on and so forth, does the Chinese government have any involvement with censorship of the internet in Hong Kong, and how has securitization over the past decade look like in Hong Kong, relative to the rest of China, and kind of involving the sort of credit system, how that kind of is implemented there?
Is this working? Yeah, I think so. Well, the internet in Hong Kong is free, it's open. The press is open in Hong Kong. And I think what's interesting about it, in a way, is the sort of draconian measures that we see in Xinjiang so far don't really apply to Hong Kong. They're using much more clever methods of suppressing people through intimidation. A lot of Chinese companies, for example, will not put ads in the Apple Daily because it's very famously program office in that newspaper. I write for it also sometimes. And so there are these tactics, there's pressure on businesses, there's a kind of corruption that comes across the border. It's kind of like multifaceted. It's almost as if you imagine 1949 and they're trying to shut down Shanghai. And so they have all these levers that they're trying to pull to intimidate people into going along with what they're doing. In Hong Kong, I think it's very subtle, and that's why in some ways it's scarier. So then pressure on the universities, and they wanted to have patriotic education for the students. So they instituted this, and of course there's pushback in Hong Kong on the streets, so they didn't get there. They're now also trying to reintroduce that. And then in the universities, we feel the pressure. Johannes Chan, my colleague, he and I were the two academics in the Article 23 Concern Group. And he's under a lot more pressure than I am because I'm not Chinese. So he gets more of the heat, and he was the dean of the Hong Kong New Law School, and he was to get promoted to a kind of somebody in their rhetoric would be equivalent to a vice president of the university. The Chinese government has newspapers, the One Way Bao, the Dagung Bao, that they own, and they just launched massive attacks against him. And I think someone counted like 500 articles that attacked him. And then eventually the government, which is so goes along with whatever China wants it to do, gets a new guy appointed as the head of the university council. And then the university council is under a lot of pressure, and they, even though Johannes Chan was chosen by an international committee, the whole 9 yards, the council Nixon, and then he's not appointed to this position. Now, the new chancellor, the new chairman of the university council, we call him King Arthur. His name is Arthur Lee. I mean, that's sort of how it goes on. They take over institutions. They've taken over pretty much all the bookstores in Hong Kong. Books that I wrote in the past could never get into the bookstore because my books would be banned. So it's multi faceted kind of thing. The press, they control or have the ability to intimidate most of it. Social media, during the umbrella movement, they were tracing social media, the Hong Kong police, and trying to go after them. So there's just, it's that kind of thing that I think is interesting. I mean, right now, my introduction didn't mention this, but I'm a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and my project is to look at democracy across Asia. And these sort of authoritarian tactics aren't unique to Hong Kong, but what's troubling is that they are in Hong Kong. You know, this tactics to repress people, to intimidate businesses, commercial enterprises, the press, the universities, it's all there.
Thank you, Davis. I have a, I presented, oh, okay. You can go to.
My name is Abdul Sabit. I'm from China, Xinjiang. I am an Uyghur. And my parents and my brother was arrested in China, Xinjiang, almost 2 years. So I want to save my parents and my brother. So what can I do, and what you can do, and what others do? So I want to know.
Ahmed, thank you. Thank you for coming and speaking up and being with us to bear witness to the effect of these policies on Americans. Our friends here who are living in America, your friends and colleagues being here on the Tufts campus. So it's not a matter of interfering if people in the US or Geneva or the UK raise their voices. It's not an anti-China initiative. It's not against the Chinese people. And it's not interfering in other people's business. It's speaking about dear relatives that you have been unable to reach, and maybe you've had some kind of indirect confirmation. Speaking of communications, phone communications are completely cut off. It's almost impossible to reach any Uyghur person in Xinjiang. It is this kind of blanket black hole of information. The main question is, if the government has made a policy decision to abandon a policy of granting nominal autonomy and some display of independent cultural heritage, the Uyghurs living in their Uyghur homeland where they always lived should be allowed to have Uyghur language in their schools, have Uyghur poetry, art, practice their religion. If that's all been abandoned, and there are additional incentives for local officials to ratchet up this policy, to get money by building the new prisons, to get money by, to gain profits by making contracts with the tech companies, and for the high-tech Chinese companies to come to Xinjiang to use the data to develop their artificial intelligence, which they would like to have be part of the leading, have Chinese artificial intelligence and facial recognition lead the world. It means it's a tall order to change the calculus, to make it more costly than profitable, to maintain this kind of shocking policy of a complete police state. So the question is, how do you raise the costs? Global Magnitsky sanctions are one. A strong congressional voice by passage of legislation would be another. And for anyone who's interested, I will tell you that sometimes as few as 10 or 20 phone calls to a member of Congress can get them to co-sponsor the bill. We expect this bill, or actually two bills, to pass this summer. Another is for the institutions of society to stand up for their values. So university values stand for what? Academic freedom, freedom of expression. I raised the question that U.S. universities and the U.S. Department of Education should not have any partnerships with the Chinese Ministry of Education at a time when it is building concentration camps. In the 1930s, in retrospect at least, but if you ask any university administrator would it be okay to continue educational exchanges with a German university at a time when an ethno-religious group is being targeted for complete suppression? Most people would say there's something wrong with that, to continue business as usual. And so this is the campaign that needs to spread, we believe, to every campus, and for people to stand up to their counterparts and say, it is not part of our values and it's not the way we conduct academic research or education, to turn the other way and say, it's normal to have this kind of massive program. So raising the cost through the institutions of society, as well as the governmental action, are the way to stand up for the civilized values that I believe everyone in this room, Chinese, Uyghur, non-Chinese, from any country, it's a common human value.
Thank you,
I
Lisa.
wanted to add something on the Xinjiang. I traveled a lot in Xinjiang a decade ago, and there were already prison farms that you would visit there, and it was quite extraordinary that the prison farms would be the only green place in what was otherwise a dry area. So the practice of having prisons in Xinjiang has deeper roots. But the thing that I've observed, because I've worked on the Tibet issue and I've written about the Tibet issue, I never got around to writing about after the trip to Xinjiang. But one observation is that the notion of autonomy in China, in some ways, is the opposite of autonomy. Because the autonomy concept is used for direct control. Ordinary places in China outside of Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Tibet are more or less, they are controlled, but they have some degree of self-rule within a communist paradigm. But these border regions, the whole idea of autonomy was used to have Beijing rule directly in the area. And so that makes it very difficult to push back, or the people there to push back. They have no real autonomy.
I just wanted to add really quickly, if you're looking for ways to advocate for getting your family released, it might be a good idea to try and get in contact with somebody like Ambassador Brownback, or if you're able to get in contact with Vice President and staff, somebody at State Department in particular, especially if they're American citizens, they may be able to advocate and find sort of back channel ways to help them get out. I would also echo Louise's comments about reaching out to various Congress members, especially those sitting on the Congressional Executive Commission on China. They're very invested in these issues, and I'm sure would be very open to helping your family out in particular. But raising your voice is so important because it needs to be heard not only by the Chinese government, but people here in the U.S. Not everybody knows that there are, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, inside of these political re-education facilities. And so I think any way that you can raise your voice and elevate this issue is truly going to make a difference. So yeah, thank you for your bravery for speaking out today.
Thank you. My name is Naimita Dipala, and I'm Uyghur origin, but I'm originally from Pakistan. And I am a scientist here, and I hold a position as a director of human stem cell laboratory here at MIT. As an expert, as my own expert opinion, I wanted to emphasize about the entire population of Xinjiang DNA testing just recently. And to tell the truth, there is a really huge connection. And I don't know if you actually, I researched it on myself. And the huge connection between the DNA sequencing and organ transplantation and forced organ harvesting. And we know that this is a huge number in China, and especially on prison people, and particularly on Falun Gong followers. And they have been imprisoned and forced harvested organ. And I think now, my Uyghur people have the same fate at the moment. And so I was just recently testifying in a UK tribunal just about a few days ago, giving my expert opinion about the link between DNA sequencing and organ transplantation. So just to make it short, it's a huge story, and it's quite disturbing. And for me as a scientist to learn all of the details, I was quite shocked, to say the least.
But my question was, so I was asked by UK judges what cost DNA sequencing in average, and I tell you, just to sequence very small part of DNA in order to find out about some inheritances of the diseases, the mutations, for the mutation, it costs at the moment here, just across this campus, in the campus of MIT, where I work, it will be an average $5,000. So we're talking about up to 20 million people DNA in her forcefully, without any consent, was withdrawn the blood and DNA was sequenced. And just the magnitude of cost of DNA sequencing for and why. Of course, it won't be done to find out inheritances and ancestry inheritance of Uyghur people, or to find out about mutation they carry in order to bypass to their next generation. That's, of course, Chinese government wouldn't pay. But there is a huge link between DNA sequencing in order to match a perfect, or let's say, a close perfect match to recipient and the donor of organ, and especially forced harvesting. So my question is to the panelists: do we know that U.S. government actually banned a U.S. citizen to go for organ, to be a recipient of organs in China? If yes, do you know this? Because I know that there are a few countries obviously have banned already, and many of them in Europe, and some even in you will be surprised, like Thailand and Taiwan, of course. And so those countries have taken a stand for, and I think this is incredibly important for the governments to take action in this manner. And I'm not sure about the U.S. government. This is my question.
Yes, thank you again for bearing witness, and well, I think we can all stand in solidarity with the pain that those who are suffering by knowing yesterday what's happening. I too am a member of the International Advisory Committee of the Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, which is taking seriously what has been considered, I must say, by many experts, policymakers, and academics as a fringe issue, and people are, again, skeptical. So I have looked myself also into great detail, and I will say that the tribunal where you testified is coming out with a big report in June, so I would urge everyone who's watching China to look out for it. It's being led by Sir Jeffrey Lees, who was one of the prosecutors for the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal. Very serious people on this commission, independent commission, and so it's to be, it should provide some definitive conclusions about whether international law has been violated. So I want to confirm what you're saying for everyone who's listening. This is not a fringe issue. It's not what other people are skeptical, partly because it's unbelievable, partly because it just doesn't have, the evidence is scattered because of the secrecy of the program. And so the tribunal will come out with that in a way that I think will enable people to look at it carefully and draw their own conclusions. So thank you for raising this issue.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I think one of the challenges in dealing with organ trafficking is that it's not actually included in the U.S. definition of trafficking in prisons. So the main body that would traditionally deal with this, the State Department's Trafficking in Prisons Office, as I understand it, doesn't see that they have jurisdiction over it, even though it is defined as trafficking, I believe, in the UN's Palermo Protocol. That might be something worth looking into because it is a potential area of advocacy. You could, for example, recommend that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act be amended to include organ trafficking so that it would fall underneath the State Department's Trafficking Office purview. But otherwise, as Lisa referenced, it's often viewed as a fringe issue. I think in part because there's no real element inside of the U.S. government designated to deal with this issue.
Thank you for, Olivia, I think I would have endorsed that, and I will say the European Union has already amended its rule, its treaty on organ trafficking on human trafficking to include organ trafficking. And several countries have passed legislation, including Taiwan, Israel, and others to require reporting of people who go abroad for organ transplants. And in some cases, nobody has banned, I believe, going to China, but rather requiring doctors who do aftercare to report, so that those people who want to save their lives nonetheless are not obtaining an organ at the expense of another innocent person's life. So that's the way to tackle it through mandatory reporting, and it needs to be done in the US. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap this up.
So my question is very vague. It's basically just about artificial intelligence. And basically it has to do with, as we see China just throwing crazy amounts of money into R&D on this new AI frontier. I feel like AI is like a buzzword nowadays. All we hear about is artificial intelligence. I wanted to ask, as China is applying this artificial intelligence research to Xinjiang, as they use it for their big data sifting and their tracking of Uyghurs, what will that mean for, I guess, U.S. national security or the security of Uyghurs? Yeah, very basic, but AI. To speak on AI.
Yes, probably Olivia has a view. I'll try to be very brief. Absolutely, the cooperation of U.S. universities, private sector like Silicon Valley, with China-based private sector or universities is highly problematic because there are no privacy protections in China. DNA can be collected forcibly from 12 or 20 million people with no protections. That does not happen in democratic countries, to provide, again, a big database with which to experiment on and to classify for future tracking purposes. So absolutely, there is pending legislation under several names, including within an act called the Uyghur Act, the Uyghur Intervention and Humanitarian Unified Response Act, which looks at social credit. It asks for a report from the government to the Congress about social credit. It imposes export restrictions on technology to Chinese state entities or state-linked entities, and also bans Chinese companies or companies that sell or provide services related to surveillance in China. That would include the AI, artificial intelligence linked surveillance from any procurement from the U.S. government, which is billions of dollars a year. So there is a strong interest in Washington in closing this policy.
Yeah, I wanted to add to this really quickly. I think that what's taking place in Xinjiang is a microcosm of what could be happening on a much broader scale if China uses AI, 5G, its surveillance technology, not only in broader China, as Louisa referenced in the context of the social credit system, but also through the potential for exporting it to other countries. And that's not even just a potential anymore, that's actually a reality. I think that we do need to be really concerned about how China is using these technologies, and that's why we need to nip in the bud what is going on in Xinjiang now before it's too late. I think the U.S. needs to view this not only as a moral issue, not only as a religious freedom issue, not only as a threat to human rights issue, but also a serious national security issue. And it's for those reasons that we should really be responding very strongly to what's taking place in Xinjiang. Sorry, my dog is running in the background. But also, I think that it's important for the U.S. to do those diplomatic efforts through the Indo-Pacific strategy and highlight the value of the U.S. engagement involving not only addressing national security issues or providing security or economic engagement to those countries, but also the value that the U.S. places in its engagement on human rights. That has to be an enduring part of our strategy, because there are going to be new frontiers that are being introduced to these various technologies that can either be used for good or used for bad. And I think that if the U.S. has strong partnerships with countries all throughout Asia, we can really influence stuff for the better over the long term. That's why we need to have a strong response to Xinjiang, but also to the other severe human rights violations taking place in China today.
Thank you. And do you have any last minute comments? All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Olivia, Lisa Grace, and Michael Davis. And next is the keynote. 2:15, we'll have 15 minutes for you to go to the bathroom, grab a bite, have some drink. Thank you guys so much.
Next.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Should I go ahead and hang up then?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, not that we did, but I was like, the pricing always, so that's an expected year. I didn't go there. That's what. I'm going to Jakarta. Then I go to Jakarta for a month. Somewhat. Why not? Actually, the earthquake. Yeah, I mean, those areas are. Oh, I mean, I just don't want. Yeah. What's our decision? I guess we're global warming is probably. Oh yeah. Whatever. Yeah.
Should have alighted.
I will. Yeah, we will. Interesting. I'll send you a link. I don't know, man. Yeah. Like in China.
Oh no, this is
Right, to come below the
well, it was a Chinese restaurant. My grandfather was being very
I see. So he wasn't like just.
He was talking about a lot of things. Very interesting.
I see.
I'm
good. I fulfill none of them. Yeah. Don't be so hard on yourself.
I mean, you could do this.
I could sign up for mailing lists.
Where are the 22 Olympics?
Beijing.
Really?
No, 2022. Where is? What year are the Winter Olympics in Beijing? Beijing. There's the Winter Olympics in Beijing soon.
Oh, it is in Beijing.
Yeah. Okay.
Yikes.
You're holding it in Beijing again.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
the
no,
Winter
these are the
Olympics.
winners. The other one, the other one is summer. Don't they do that in the city? No. Okay. It's every 2. So there's Olympics every 2 years, but one of them is every 4, I think.
Yeah. Well, no, each Olympics, summer is every 4, winter is every 4, but they're alternating.
Yes, so
years.
there's an Olympics every 2.
Yes.
Oh, right.
Lionel, what are you reading?
What?
What are you reading?
Reading class. Reading's for nerds. I never do it. That's YJ. Just kidding. I actually do the reading. Like I do. Well, I mean, you're not in the. No, but I feel like I should. Respect for the educator. YJ's a perfect crotchety old man.
I love YJ.
No respect at all.
YJ makes me happy.
Yeah.
He's nice and different.
That sounds like a winning recipe. Also sounds like the perfect description of a sugar daddy.
Okay, Lionel. I wasn't gonna go there. I was just y'all.
I went there. That's all.
Plus, if I really wanted a sugar daddy, I wouldn't be going for someone who's, going to be a teacher in Singapore. Maybe I'd go for those Goldman Sachs Harvard boys. If you know any, please let me know.
It's 1-1. It was 1 last time I checked. It's still 1-1.
This is mine. This is like what happened. No, it's like my family's side didn't want to be we're like, next we're out of here. The peninsula of Malaysia is
Super Anderson could choose.
Seems like you want on pizza.
And like those types of players seem to gravitate towards us. Like actually.
I keep trying. Fine, I'll get past my bag. Yo, you missed out. You know,
I know, I saw the pick after. I can't wait for this one.
Yeah,
I feel like a good question to ask is just
might try to ask it.
Go ahead. So it's a red. No.
Come on. Oh my god. For United? Yeah, I don't think you think. Okay, what am I pulling up?
Hey, nobody has a monopoly on this stuff.
You have an operator for what?
Nobody has a monopoly on this stuff. So what?
Come on, you scored a Pogba.
Did he score? I'm assuming he scored because you're happy.
Yes.
Oh wait, you look over.
Second of what? Second of what? Second of what? No. It's definitely this week.
Right?
Yeah, Tuesday. Just like the fucking dude who came to the Confucius who was like, I'm from China, and like he's back to his town. They should have.
In a lot of ways, I think that they're doing their part to
say you was very opposed to it, but modeling
Yeah.
At least I
And
definitely.
also, the Tough Chinese department has just been improved by their existence. Like, there's more resources and better resources.
Also, it was really nice.
Just taking it back. That's good.
And also, I think some so-called kind of they themselves, they don't want us to read this way.
What on? How much food is left?
That's why I got mine.
I'm pretty goddamn hungry.
There might be some pizza.
I had practice.
There might be some pizza.
No, frisbee.
Because I
Some drugs are terrible.
You work out?
Oh, did you pull something? No, I just crashed. Wow. Yes, I practiced. Oh, really? I hate you guys.
Can you sing acapella by any chance?
Oh my god, watch it. I'm gonna rip your fucking hair out. Oh, so balls.
You brought that one for yourself.
I'm leaving it never coming back.
Thanks for the phone. Oh.
This is the worst day ever.
Water.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's actually beautiful. It's actually beautiful. Yes.
Did you know that?
You're on the live stream. Yes. Go ahead.
Did you know that the bigger people are becoming?
No.
They just.
I mean, yeah.
I think we should try
Answer the question from your team. Channeling your element.
But only
like American.
I've got it on there.
Swipe to wherever you can.
No, have you played RPG? Every other nation. What? You played RPG right now?
No.
You guys on the live stream, I'm just saying. The live stream is right here.
Yeah, when watching started
Down with
using
YJ.
That would be a good start.
Alright, so thank you.
Wow, thank you.
I think like the lid. First, no.
Oh, it's your birthday.
What is that?
I don't know.
Well, look where you're born.
I'm not voting, but I know it's for May.
Jerry walking into a church.
What's wrong with that? Something's wrong with it. The image is wrong with it.
Which one?
It's a brutal. Wait, does it actually exist? I'm really
No, if she's February, then Amethyst. So I only know Amethyst because that's fine.
sure you got just you should just say that.
No, look at this phone.
It's cold, but.
Legendary.
I can throw you. What do you mean by pasta salad? Connor, tell them about pasta salad. Tell them about tonight. Dinner. What's that? Is that just noodles and beefs? It's like beef. No, like no. Well, I genuinely wondering what's pasta salad.
Pasta and salad.
Right. So it's noodles and beefs. That's what it says. Pasta salad. Yeah. Right.
Please,
Is it pasta?
please enjoy images of a pasta salad.
Okay. So it's pasta with salad, but enjoy.
It's
what?
it's
It's not
full.
like a Caesar salad.
So I'm speaking first, right?
Yeah, what I did.
Okay. Can I send you a device?
Sure.
Okay, you can read it from your phone. It's short.
Sure. Yeah.
How much? I have 15
We're
minutes, right?
just about ready to start the next part of our program for today. So if you just finish up your conversations and take your seats, that would be great. Thank you. All right. Thank you everyone for coming back to join us. We are about to move into the second part of our program for today, which is the keynote address by Dr. Fang Xiaoyang. But I figured rather than everyone hearing from me, because you heard from me yesterday, I'll let one of our seniors, Layla, who has worked really hard to invite Dr. Fang to today's symposium to introduce Dr. Fang.
Hi everyone, thanks for staying with us and joining us for the keynote panel. I'm Layla, I'm a senior studying international relations at Tufts University. It's quite an honor to have Dr. Tom from Tsinghua University in Beijing fly all the way here to give the keynote speech. Dr. Tao Xiaoyang is the Vice Chair of the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University and Deputy Director at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. His research interests include political philosophy, China's engagement in Africa, and the modernization process of the developing countries. He's the author of the book China-Africa Economic Diplomacy, which was published in 2014, and has published extensively on Asia-Africa relations. Let's welcome Dr. Tao Xiaoyang.
Thank you. So I would like to use this chance to talk more about the theory bigger picture. So especially to understand the debate about the China model. While actually the following panel on the Belt and Road and the economics, then I will then maybe say more like a concrete facts and more up-to-date development. So this hour will rather be a bigger philosophical and theoretical discussion on the China's relationship with the developing countries. So here we see in the last decade, actually China has developed quite quickly its tie with the developing world. So here you can see first the Belt and Road, and most of it covered the developing countries. Then with that, we have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then we also have two multilateral mechanism. One is called FOCAC, so that's above there. So Forum of China and Africa Cooperation. Then down there is BRICS. So we know this 5 large developing countries coming together every year. So this is one thing, and then we also see some figures like the investment, trade and investment with these developing countries. Here, LIC stands for the least, the low-income countries, and the LMIC stands for lower middle-income countries. So when we compare China's trade with this low-income countries, we find they actually increased 32 times during last 20 years, while China's trade volume with the whole world just grew 12 times. So that means China's engagement with these low-income countries, they grow 3 times faster than the global trend. So China's like a relation with the global with the other countries. So these are this low-income and lower middle-income countries. A list of that. You can see most of them in Africa, and also quite a few in South Asia or Southeast Asia. And then particularly then we see a more astonishing figure from Africa, because China's trade with Africa it's more than US, Japan, France, and UK. Their trade with Africa combined in 2015. And China has become Africa's largest bilateral trade partner since 2009, and today it still remains so, and by far the largest one. And also another is about Chinese construction companies. They took over half of the market share in Africa's construction market since 2015. So these are the just shows how the Chinese engagement with Africa, with developing countries, how significant they are. And this has already been perceived as early as 2013 when Obama visited Africa. Then CNN report there's just one word subtext to his trip to Africa, that's China. And then actually earlier this December last year, when John Bolton, he announced the new Africa strategy of the Trump administration. Actually, people counted In that strategy document, China was mentioned 15 times, while the largest two countries in Africa, Nigeria and South Africa, was not mentioned even once. So this you can see this China's relationship with Africa actually has become a key concern of U.S. diplomatic strategy. And the same is for Abe. When Prime Minister Abe visited there, BBC reported he was asked whether he just come to compete with China. And then how to explain this increasing engagement between China and developing countries, and especially why it is so effective that U.S. and Japan, they were eclipsed by this engagement. Then there are several proposed explanations. Some proposed earlier that natural resources are at the core of China's economic interests. But in fact, when we compare the trade between China, US, and the EU with Africa, we find a quite similar pattern. So namely, all these countries, their major import from Africa are primary materials, and then they export manufactured goods. So with this, then we cannot see why China is particularly strong with the developing countries, because everybody do the same. And then another explanation, and people these 2 days we heard often about the authoritarianism, saying China is promoting liberal capitalism, or try to build the alternative international structure, and also then to especially like interested in working with these troubled countries like Sudan and Zimbabwe, etc. But this was not supported empirically either. When we compare China's top 10 trade partners, actually we find out these trade partners, they have a very diverse characteristic. So we have so first is this left line is this trade volume, and then also after that the right line is the doing business rank by World Bank. We see actually there are like authoritarian states, something like Myanmar that time, and also DRC, or these are not considered as very democratic. But then there are also countries like India, Indonesia, Philippines, which actually are relatively doing well in the developing countries in terms of governance. Actually, Chinese economic engagement with them do not really limited to those who like are particularly authoritarian or have a bad governance. And also another thing we see when we analyze the trade of US and China respectively with the African countries, we find that just the Chinese economic engagements, they are much more diverse than the US. So for US, 72% of their trade with Africa concentrated in 6 countries, which are relatively better off in the continent. While 72% of China's trade is actually spread in 11 countries. That's already like so 1/5 of the whole of all the countries in Africa. So then we look. So this just shows the Western, something like this. Researchers in the West, their proposed explanation do not work. But when we look at the Chinese perspective, they are not valid either. So some of these are the 2 Chinese scholars saying it's more about a friendship, about a political sovereignty, this respect of African independence, etc. But the problem is this kind of political principles, they are there since the 1950s. right? So for more than 50 years, more than half century, the Chinese government always have the same principle with the African countries. But actually, this rapid development between China and the developing countries, it happened just during last 10 or 15 years. It's a relatively new phenomenon. And then, but however, when we look at the African perspectives, we maybe see some of these practitioners' words shed some light on the drive or on their perception of the difference. So they said why they like to work with Chinese, because the European and American aid, they do not deliver the sustainable development while Chinese promote trade. That's Rwanda's President Paul Kagame said. And then two Senegalese presidents, Wade and Sa, they all said the China's approach is kind of better and adapted to this local situation. And while the Western approaches, they are simply too slow, and Chinese are direct and faster. Okay, so this actually just give us some initial understanding. We see that China's there's like we call it, some people call it Beijing consensus, which are characterized as fast, pragmatic, while the Washington consensus, they often then stress the conditionality and stress the liberal, neoliberalism and also the governance. And then this is the question, whether this like a pragmatism, do they really like this pragmatism? What is this Beijing consensus of pragmatism? So regarding the Beijing consensus, again, we have, so this now it comes to the development model of China itself. Because when we talk about these different ways, it's all about China's own development. And then there's a discussion, so people took it for granted that it's about state capitalism, about authoritarian economic control. But this is again quite contested in the economics field, because people find the most competitive economic segment in China is the coastal private sector. Like what we today we see the e-commerce, we see this manufacturing sector. They are all private business. They are not controlled by the government. While these sectors like steel, telecom, these sectors which are controlled by the state companies, they often are incompetitive and however overcapacity. And then the Chinese government and Chinese policy, in fact, they changed over the course of the last 4 decades. And there's in different period, like in 1980s, 1990s, and then today, and almost we say every 2 years, 3 years, we see there's a very big change. Actually, last year the model is quite different from this year's model. So there's like a generalization of simple like a developmental state. It's just too abstract and also stereotype. It doesn't see the subtlety and also the real effective part of the Chinese economy. And then another question is somebody also proposed this second best strategy, saying that China just when it cannot reach the like best standard, which the Washington consensus maintained, China is just like doing the second best one. But this is a way of like people can say it's China just will approach, will like get closer to this best standard. But this kind of view again went bankrupt last year when actually the trade war is actually that's because the people in Washington, they actually saw that China does not move to the direction of this so-called best standard, right? you find out China actually is going to a very different way. So actually the second, it's China's development is not a transitional step towards the ultimate destination defined by Washington Consensus, but it's rather actually a different direction. And there's some also people like William Easterly, who's a World Bank economist, said that's an approach of planners and searchers saying because the Washington Consensus, that's like defines plans, while the Chinese, they are pragmatic, they are just searchers. But again, this doesn't fit to the China's reality, because China is known for its plans. Right? Every 5 years, the Central Committee gives some plans. And when we come to the Washington, to the US economy, actually the planning element is much less. Although that's ironically, when the US economy when the US government works with the developing countries, they have plans. But however, when we look at the country itself, it doesn't have so much planning as China has. Yeah, so all this cannot really explain the Chinese model of development. But at least we can see from all this discussion, like we can see some get some takeaways. First, China's engagement clear focus on commercial interests. And second, it's true, they have incremental adjustment to, but this adjustment then, when it accumulates, it leads to a significant paradigm shift. So this actually can be summarized in 2 words of Deng Xiaoping. Namely, one is that it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Second is cross the river by feeding stones. I think everybody in the China studies knows these 2 phrases. But I argue that these 2 phrases have not been sufficiently studied in the West or in China. Actually, even in China, people saying that every day, but people doesn't understand the meaning very clearly. And but before I explain that, I would say China's engagement with the developing countries, they also have this similar pattern. So this too, China's own development model and its impact on the developing countries, these actually are 2 closely related. And we can see with the developing countries, China also started with this support of socialist partners and the independence movement, and then enter into cooperative production and joint ventures. And then later move on to focus on financing infrastructure, trade and investment. That's mainly what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. And this also see this commercial interest and the incremental change. Then now we see in both of this engagement and this changes, transformations. Actually, we see the catching mice and the crossing river. Both they indicate a goal, because the problem about the pragmatism is often pragmatism. It doesn't have a long-term goal, right? So in US, in Europe, people also talk about pragmatism. In Africa, also people talk about pragmatism. When you are a businessman, you have make money immediately. That's called a pragmatism. When you are a policymaker, you get elected. That's you have the approach of pragmatism. And but however, then in China, we first see this pragmatism of catching mice and crossing river. It has a consensus of goals. Namely, that's the goal of productivity growth, economic growth, and that's already written since the 1980s in the charter of Chinese Communist Party. So the party before 1978, its goal was the class struggle, was the socialist ideology. But after 1980s, it has changed its goal, and this goal becomes the mice, to be kept, to be caught, and also the river to be crossed. And then another thing is this pragmatism. They just leaves the path to this destination widely open. And while the Washington Consensus actually tries to define the path, namely Washington Consensus saying you must have this good governance or conditionality in order to reach the goal of the growth. But China said, actually you don't need a conditionality. As long as you can reach the goal, the same goal, then it's fine. And so actually then that's the essence of the Chinese development experience is simply to reject this consensus or models of a development path. So its goal, it shares a common goal with the donors from the Western countries. Also, when we talk to USAID, talk to World Bank, they also say we want the developing countries to get developed. Right, so this goal, that's why actually there are often cooperation between China and this donor organizations in Washington. And but then the different approaches just in Washington institutions, they like to define more on the path, while China then leaves the path relatively open. We will see that more clearly in the case studies there. And then the question is why this goal of productivity growth matters, and also why the diverse approaches which is better to reach this goal. This actually because actually the productivity of growth, that's something we can already see today. It's a common sense. Everybody said, even these developing countries, they said we want a productivity growth, we want a better life, living standard. But then we see actually this is not the case in most of the world, maybe 200 years ago. So this is the first quote from China, which emphasizes no matter Confucianism or Taoism, then everything, Buddhism, all the things they put emphasis on the virtue, on the spiritual part, while the material goal, productivity, is always secondary. And that's also the case when we see a famous example of Zheng He's voyage. This is Zheng He's vessels in comparison to Christopher Columbus' boat. Zheng He actually sailed to Africa in Southeast in the Pacific Ocean almost 1 century before Christopher Columbus. And his vessels, his fleet was much larger than Columbus. But actually the problem is that Zheng He's fleet, their mission is not to really promote trade, but it's just about send missionaries to promote the enlightened form of civilization and also to carry gift to give them. That's also the one thing why Zheng He actually doesn't build any colonies. Because for them, they want to show the courtesy, to show the virtues of the central dynasty. While in comparison, Columbus and these European sailors, their purpose is trade, and for that purpose, they build colonies and conquer the whole world. Right. So this is just shows the difference of actually the European since the Columbus and also this earlier capitalism. Then we see their purpose already shifted to this productivity growth, while the Chinese still remain in the older ones of spiritual, of all this cultural prosperity. So this actually leads to a very stark contrast between the two civilizations' destinies during the next 300 years. We all know that even China was half colonized and conquered. Hong Kong and also this Tibet, these provinces are all the provinces left from this colonialism. And but we see even for the West, this kind of productivity growth is not their intrinsic cultural value from the very beginning. from Plato, from Thomas Aquinas, we actually see also very different orientation as even until the late Middle Ages. And also some African proverbs say the same thing. They actually, even when you go to the developing countries, you would rather notice that they focus more on the spiritual value instead of the productivity growth. And this just shows the problem is actually this shift of the goal towards productivity trend growth. That's just a new thing in the modern ages, and especially with the emerging of capitalism. And this is the definition of capitalism I use from the Capital of Karl Marx. So I do not buy the labor value of Karl Marx, but I think as an academic scholar, Karl Marx gave the most succinct definition of capitalism just through this equation. Namely, the first he said the traditional society, the change is about commodity, money to commodity. So when you exchange, like to go to, there's only very limited exchange. But the capitalists, their purpose of having this exchange is to have increased value. So namely the second equation, money invested for commodity, then for more money. And in fact, the third equation, this says more about capitalism. Because when you got the surplus value, got profit from investment, you want to invest even more. So this kind of pursuit, they can continue without stop. So this is about the development and about the sustainable productivity growth. So this is the goal towards the productivity growth. That's just implied in the capitalism. And how to reach this capitalism? Actually, then we also got some from the Adam Smith. It's about division of labor, like we see in the picture. The earlier capitalism, how they can get richer, get wealth, get powerful. It's just a simple example of restructuring of division of labor, because that increases the specialization, increases productivity, and also then lead to the use of machinery. And but with the huge productivity growth, then we actually need also market. So that's why market is required for capitalism. And so this is what I said in the last line. So money to commodity, so that's the industry production. When you produce so many numerous products, it always requires mass distribution and a market to be sustainable. So that's why market is always important. So these are just some more theoretical treatment of that. But I think that's ultimately important for understanding the Chinese model. So here we can see why it's in maybe this picture to illustrate the difference. So previously we had this villages, traditional society. Actually some economists, they counted in the traditional society, it's usually like a self-sustaining economy, rural economy. Today, when you go to the developing countries, poor countries, you often see this self-sufficient subsistence still existing. And for them, very few demand of the trade. While the capitalism is the division of labor specialization together with the mass distribution, with the large scale of market. And that actually also requires a transformation of a social structure. As Max Weber and also Karl Polanyi, they pointed out in this, I actually give the PowerPoint already to the organizer. If you want, you can see the details. It's about you need this transformation of production activity as well as consumption activity in this new change. And the reason why socialism failed is actually they only, this picture just shows the failure of socialism. Socialism actually for me, that's not about ideology, because the ideology is a part. They argue that, actually they collapsed more because of the economy cannot sustain. Because then for them, without this market distribution, they only focus on the production, and that made them unable to distribute and to recircle this circulate this commodity. It cannot become further profit. So this continuous sustainable growth cannot go on because it's actually cut off by the planning. And then this is the thing. Now I need to come back after this historical theoretical treatment. Come back to say today's relationship with the developing countries. So that is about the chicken and egg dilemma. Namely what? Namely when you want to have this capitalist production way and also this capitalist distribution market, you need a societal transformation, right? So actually, also you need, especially then the governments, to keep this transformation, to keep this capitalist circulation going. And but then that is the question often, that's the problem often very challenging in the developing countries. Because when you want to change the society, you also then first need the capitalist, this factories in place. And then this is a chicken and egg dilemma, namely which one should go first. You should have already like a functioning market first, or you should have a society like with this separated, with this like consumption, living standard, with this specialized labor. This all is in place, and then you can have the functioning market. Actually, we find recently a scholar from Michigan, so Yuan An, she published a book about how China escaped the poverty trap. And he actually noticed this problem of there's a precondition for the economic growth, namely the bureaucracy and this accountability, as we talked all these governance issues. He said it seems that this bureaucracy, strong governance, they often just related to strong economy, right? You need a strong economy, then you can get strong bureaucracy. But then the question is often people also argue, if you don't have strong governance, you don't have strong economy. So this is the chicken and egg dilemma. But then she suggested that it's rather the market and the states, they interact to each other. So there's no like a one way to mechanism. But it's actually a circulation. So it's a co-evolution process in China and in different periods of development. Here is just an illustration of how this all these different elements from a market, from administration and infrastructure and skills, urbanization, they move together to another one. This is just about the urbanization and example. So this is maybe just to illustrate these two different models of thinking. On this, the rocket, actually Yuan An, she made an artificial distinction between complicated and complex. Complicated refers to the building of a rocket, which is very complicated. But however, when you press the button, you can definitely see just a one-way mechanism to go up. And she thinks that's the way of thinking. Just when governance or something can lead to development. But actually, I would suggest there's another way, another thinking of this mechanism. Namely, this is the interactive circular mechanism. It's like a soccer match. So actually, when you want to score, make a good pass, in soccer, you cannot decide from any elements. It's actually only through combination of your running, of the like path from from maybe your teammate, etc. So you actually influence each other, right? So this it's just a very different logic from the rocket engineering. So it's about how we understand this chicken and egg dilemma, because you can never find a 0 point which is chicken or egg, but it's always both parts had a little